All right, hello and welcome to the video lecture for Attitudes and Persuasion, Day 3 for Social Psychology, Spring 2018. Glad you found everything okay. Let's go ahead and get right into it. So on Tuesday, we talked about persuasion. We started talking about how other people can persuade us, and we talked about those cornerstones of persuasion, those message effects, source effects, audience effects, and context effects. But that's not the whole story for persuasion. So there's a little more that we can talk about today with the elaboration likelihood model, which adds another level of complexity and thus a better understanding of how persuasion really works. Then we'll get into subliminal advertising and resisting persuasion attempts as well. Now, we've talked a little before about sort of stalling points in the field of social psychology. For example, when we talked about attitudes, we talked about how for a while there it looked like attitudes weren't really predicting behavior, in which case, what the heck is the point of studying attitudes? Well, persuasion research hit a similar roadblock where they ran into this problem with a lot of inconsistencies in persuasion research. So a lot of research found that very strong arguments can be highly persuasive. We talked about that as a message effect, right? Having high quality arguments. But then again, some research found that they were not highly persuasive. Research found that people can be persuaded by experts regardless of what those experts are arguing. That's like a source effect, right? Expertise. But then again, sometimes that wasn't the case. And this led researchers to really wonder, okay, what the heck? When are people persuaded and why? Enter the elaboration likelihood model to help organize the field of persuasion research and explain these inconsistencies. So the elaboration likelihood model was posited by Rich Petty and John Cacioppo. And this is what they said about the elaboration likelihood model, called the ELM for short. They said, that's all well and good, those cornerstones of persuasion, but not everyone's going to process messages the same way. So the main idea is that we don't all process messages the same way. The name of the model, elaboration likelihood model, sounds a little weird, but elaboration likelihood, that term really just means the probability that someone's going to think carefully. So elaboration in this case means like thinking, likelihood meaning like probability, hence elaboration likelihood, probability that someone's going to think carefully. So people vary in how much they think about a message, how motivated they are to think carefully about a message. Some people want to think really carefully and some people don't want to think carefully at all. And that affects our responses to messages and determines what route to persuasion we're going to be on. Now, when I say the term route to persuasion, this is what I mean. There's one route to persuasion according to the ELM, that's the central route. This is where we're influenced by the strength and the quality of message arguments. This is like the high end of elaboration when we're thinking a lot. If we're on the central route to persuasion, it means that we're paying a lot of attention to how high quality those message arguments are. We're not paying as much attention to the other cornerstones like source effects, audience, well, I guess audience effects still matter. We're not really paying attention to source effects or context effects. Instead, it's really just message quality that we're paying attention to. However, that's not the case for everyone, so not everyone is always on the central route to persuasion. Instead, people are often on the peripheral route to persuasion, which is where we're not thinking critically about message arguments. Instead, we're just focusing on superficial characteristics. So the peripheral route, this is the low end of elaboration, because you're not really thinking about the message specifically, you're not really evaluating the strength of that particular message. Instead, you're paying more attention to those superficial cues. So if we're going to put it into a spectrum, it would look like this. We have low elaboration at this sort of far left end, that's the peripheral route. High elaboration at the far right end, that's the central route. The higher you are in elaboration, in other words, the more you are thinking carefully about the message itself, the more likely you are to be on the central route, vice versa for the peripheral route. Now, technically, these routes are on a continuum, so it's not necessarily all one or the other. More often, we can have a mix of the two. Sometimes, for example, we're processing information more centrally, but still a little peripherally. And we'll talk a little bit about the nuances here as we keep going. But for ease of discussion, for the most part, we're going to treat them as completely separate routes. Now, an important thing to keep in mind here, it's easy to think that central route must be the more accurate route because here you're really paying attention to the message itself, whereas peripheral, you're not really thinking about the message itself. But being on the central route alone doesn't necessarily guarantee accuracy. Just because you're thinking carefully doesn't mean that you're being super accurate. Often that happens, but not always. And similarly, being on the peripheral route doesn't mean less persuasion than the central route. That's a really easy mistake to make here. If you're on the peripheral route, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be persuaded. It means you are going to be persuaded. You're just persuaded by other things. So not the message quality, but instead those superficial cues like who the source is. And we'll talk about this again as we keep going too. But ultimately, the idea here with the elaboration likelihood model, the ELM, is that the more elaboration, so the more message relevant thinking we've got going on, the more likely people are to go the central route, to focus on the quality of the message, compared to going the peripheral route where they're focusing on the superficial. So thinking more means you're on the central route. So here's an example of an ad. This is an ad for PETA, right? It says, "Let vegetarianism grow on you." This would be an example of trying to persuade someone to go vegetarian by using the peripheral route. So this is what's occurring with low elaboration of the message content, right? People aren't really thinking about the content, which makes sense because there isn't really any message content in this message, right? They're not giving you good arguments for why you should go vegetarian. Instead, there's just this funny little catchphrase, "Let vegetarianism grow on you." This picture of this attractive model, right? We talked about likability with physical attractiveness as a source characteristic. It's really just a source characteristic going on here. There isn't really a strong argument to go vegetarian beyond that. So again, when you're on the peripheral route, it means you've got those superficial cues that are determining whether persuasion occurs. So again, when you're on the peripheral route, that means that your elaboration is low. You're not thinking very much, right? Instead, you're focusing on cues, and cues can be anything superficial other than the message quality. So that's like the design of the ad, the colors used in the ad, celebrities endorsing the product in the ad, attractiveness, right? Humor, anything attention grabbing for only the sake of grabbing your attention, not actually trying to convey some information about the product or message or the topic or whatever it is that the person's trying to convince you on. Instead, just those cues. These like popularity, price, packaging, all that kind of stuff counts as cues. Now again, when you're on the peripheral route, it means your arguments are not carefully evaluated. You're not paying a lot of attention to whether they're strong arguments. Like in that vegetarianism ad, there isn't even really an argument. It's just saying, hey, vegetarianism is cool, but it's not really giving you a reason other than that. So you're not carefully evaluating those arguments. When people are persuaded via the peripheral route, so they're persuaded just by those cues, not by argument quality, that tends to result in weaker attitudes. Remember last time, or 2 times ago, I guess, we talked about attitude strength. So stronger attitudes are ones that are more resistant to change, more persistent over time, and more predictive of behavior. When somebody's persuaded to change their attitude on the peripheral route, that tends to result in weaker attitudes. So attitudes that are less resistant to change, so you're more likely to get persuaded again the other direction. They're not persistent over time, so they're not likely to stick with you, and they're less predictive of behavior. So if you're persuaded via the peripheral route, you saw that vegetarian ad, and you were like, oh, I like that actress, maybe I should try being vegetarian, it's less likely to actually predict your behavior of eating vegetarian. So resulting in weaker attitudes. Again, not less persuasion, just weaker attitudes, which in turn, as I said before, means that those attitudes are less predictive of your later behavior. So again, like that vegetarian ad, you're less likely to actually eat vegetarian if you were persuaded via the peripheral route. Now this ad, on the other hand, this is an ad that's an example of the central route. So this ad also supports vegetarianism, right? 25 reasons to try vegetarian. But this is definitely more of a central route ad. So this is what's occurring with high elaboration of the message content, which again involves careful thought about the message. Here's where the strength of the arguments matter for persuasion, and hence why, as you can see by all this text, there actually are messages about vegetarianism. So there's 25 reasons to try eating vegetarian. Presumably, if we read them, they would seem well researched, or at least hopefully they would. But at any rate, they're giving you actually a message, and they're trying to give you a high quality message through which to convince you to try going vegetarian. So this ad then is trying to catch people who are on the central route to persuasion. So central route, again, this is where elaboration is very high, so this is where you're really thinking. Again, remember, elaboration in the ELM just means thinking, careful thought. So you're at the high end of the elaboration, so you're very likely to think carefully. That means that you are focusing on the strength of the message arguments. So you're not really paying attention as much to the peripheral cues, like the colors involved in that ad and in the previous slide there. Instead, you're focusing on the arguments. You're carefully evaluating the strength of those arguments, and you're deciding, are these good reasons to go vegetarian or not? So if somebody is persuaded via the central route, that results in stronger attitudes. So it's the opposite of peripheral route. It results in stronger attitudes, meaning that if you are carefully evaluating aspects of a persuasive message or on the central route, if you are then persuaded by that ad, then you tend to have stronger attitudes. So that tends to be more resistant to change. Someone later tries to change your mind about why being vegetarian is bad for you or something like that. If you were persuaded via the central route, you're less likely to change your mind. You're more likely to see this persistence in attitude over time. And again, it's more predictive of behavior, right? So if you really want to get somebody to change their behavior, you're trying to launch a persuasion technique to do that or tactic to do that, you really probably should target the central route because that's going to be the most predictive of behavior. So again, with the central route, you're focusing on the actual message itself. How good are the arguments from that message? All right, now let's do a little review, we're going to look at a couple of ads here, and I'm going to have you stop it for a minute and think about whether these ads are going to be more successful in persuading someone who's on the central route, who's very thinking carefully, or someone who's on the peripheral route, who's not really thinking carefully. So take a minute and think about this one, this Adidas ad. You probably came to the conclusion that this would be more of a peripheral ad. If so, that would be correct because there aren't really strong arguments here, right? The only argument you can really see is that if you wear these shoes, they're going to turn into paint while you're wearing them. That's obviously not what the ad's really trying to say. It's just a cool looking ad. So somebody who's on the peripheral route is going to look at this ad and think, oh, that's really cool. Adidas must be really cool. Maybe I should get some Adidas. Whereas someone on the central route is not going to be as impressed with just this particular ad. All right, how about this one? If you thought central, that would be right. One of the big tip-offs here that it's a central ad and not a peripheral ad is that it's got a lot of text. All right, if you're on the peripheral route, you're not really going to be into this text. You're not even going to bother to read it probably, let alone carefully evaluate it. Instead, if you're on the central route, though, you're looking for a good reason why this particular vehicle is a good one to buy, and you read all this text, presumably it's got some strong arguments in there that might convince you that this is a good car for you to spend your money on. All right, how about this one? This one is a little bit of both. So I said before that we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of the middle of the continuum there, right? This is one of the ones where it might be more in the middle of the continuum. So there are some aspects about this ad that would be appealing to someone on the central route. So for example, the text here is saying it's thinner, lighter, faster, has FaceTime, smart covers, 10-hour battery. These are all good arguments for why you should get an iPad 2. So it's fast, it's light, right? These are good reasons for why you should buy this. So somebody who's on the central route, who's motivated to think carefully about this ad, is going to read this text and is going to think, okay, is this worth it? So that might get some people on the central route, but it's also got a bit of a peripheral route going on, right? Because it's a pretty picture, the iPad looks nice, right? It's a nice ad, it's well designed. So if you're on the peripheral route, you still might get a little bit of persuasion here as well. All right, now what about this one? This one is probably mostly peripheral, right? It's got a really pretty picture, nice looking picture. It's designed to look very impressive, be very eye-catching. It's not necessarily a strong argument about this car, right? Unless they're trying to argue that this car really does have very good towing ability. It's a pretty small car, so I'm not sure it could really tow that towboat, right? But if that's part of the argument, then perhaps a little central, but probably mostly peripheral. And then how about this one? This one is probably also peripheral. There's not really a strong argument here with this gun, consider your man card reissued, right? Unless you're somebody who puts a lot of stock in that whole idea of having a man card, in which case maybe this might be a strong argument, but for the most part, it's probably a little more peripheral. All right, so now let's go ahead and do our part one of the lecture, the video lecture response here. Okay, so this is the video response part one. So what you're going to do here, there's an ad. I've posted the YouTube link onto the module for this video lecture. I can't play it within the video lecture, unfortunately, so you got to go to that separately. What I want you to do is watch the ad. I've got the link on the next screen in case you can't access the link via Dropbox, or sorry, via Blackboard. So watch the ad that's on the next screen for TurboTax and think about how this ad might be persuasive, both to people on the central route and people on the peripheral route, to explain your responses with a few sentences. So what you're going to do for this, you can just open up a Word document, for example, put your name at the top, then write video response part one, and then write your paragraph or so response to the ad with some aspects of the ad that be persuasive to either the central route or peripheral route people. There's going to be a part 2 later on in the lecture, so once you get there, you can just put it onto the same document, just put video response part 2, and then put your answer to the second part in the same document. Once you're done with the whole video lecture, you've got your 2 responses, then you can submit it via the Blackboard Dropbox. So again, I can't play it for you in the video lecture, unfortunately, but the link is on the next slide. I'll linger for a second there in case you want to pause and grab it. Otherwise, I've posted the link onto Blackboard in the module, so you can just pull that up on your computer. It's like a minute long, just watch it real quick, and then you can come back to this slide and do your response. All right, so in case you didn't grab the link from Blackboard, if you copy over the link that's at the bottom of the slide right here, it will take you to the ad. So again, just be sure that you write your couple sentences by paragraph total response to the question on the previous slide. Once you're done with that, then you can come back here and keep moving on to the rest of the lecture. Alright, so now that we know what the 2 roots are, we know about the central root and the peripheral root. If you're thinking more carefully, you're on the central, less carefully, you're on the peripheral. Now the question becomes, how do we know who is on what root? So we've talked about how you're either thinking more carefully or you're not. What determines whether you're thinking more carefully or not? So elaboration likelihood model, right? That's what this is all about. When are people going to be on which root? It turns out that the answer to this question is something that we've already talked about before. It's motivation and ability. So elaboration depends on both motivation and ability. So you got to be both able and motivated to think carefully in order to be on the central root. And if not, if we're not motivated, we're not able to think carefully to be on the central root, then we're going to default to being on the peripheral root. So where have we seen this before? Hopefully you're thinking, oh, that seems familiar from social cognition. We talked about automatic versus controlled processes. It's also familiar based on the correction model from attribution and person perception. Got to be both motivated and able to make a correction for the situation. Well, motivation and ability is relevant here too. So you've got to kick it up a notch into controlled processing. Controlled processing being your ability to evaluate a message carefully. So if you're not motivated and able, you get stuck in peripheral root, then you just pay attention to the cues. Alright, so what actually affects these? So when it comes to persuasion, what affects people's motivation and ability to think carefully? So knowing that is the first step to knowing which route is going to be used at any given time. So when we think about motivation to think carefully, we're thinking about a lot of different things. We've talked before about how people tend to be cognitive misers, right? We don't want to expend any more mental effort than we have to. We want to conserve our cognitive resources as much as possible. So people would rather not think carefully if we don't have to. So what can compel us to not be so lazy and to actually put in the time and thought and effort into carefully processing persuasive messages? And there are a couple of things that are relevant here. So one is personal relevance. So the more relevant it is to you personally, the more motivated you are to think carefully about that message. So for example, if I was going to tell you guys about a proposed fee increase in tuition at University of Massachusetts, it's not as personally relevant. You might not want to think very carefully about it, but like, yeah, whatever. Versus if I tell you about that proposed fee increase here at BSU, suddenly now it's very personally relevant. You're a lot more motivated to carefully evaluate that message and to think carefully and thoughtfully about what I'm telling you. Another aspect that affects motivation to think is what we call accountability. So accountability means if you have to justify your choice later. So for example, say that your boss is going to go on a trip and they need you to choose a rental car for them, one that's going to be most cost efficient, the best for what their purposes, whatever those purposes are. Your job is to pick that rental car. When you're looking at rental cars and trying to decide which one is the best one, you're accountable for the decision you make because your boss is going to be the one who's dealing with the consequences of whatever vehicle you choose. So because you're accountable, it means that you're probably going to be a lot more likely to very carefully think about the pros and cons of various rental cars. So you're going to be elaborating more, you're going to be thinking more, you're going to be more on the central route when they're trying to persuade you to go with that particular car to rent. So accountability, you've got to justify your decision or your choice later on. You're accountable for it. That really amps up our motivation to think carefully. The third thing that we'll talk about is something called need for cognition, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. So the need for cognition, basically what this means is a chronic motivation to think deeply. So the ones from the previous slide, personal relevance and accountability, those are a little more situation specific. So a certain situation, you mean you're more or less accountable for your decision, or a certain situation is more or less personally relevant. Need for cognition is a bit more stable. It's a bit more of an individual difference. So some people are more motivated to think more deeply most of the time, whereas other people are not. So need for cognition you can think of as being an individual difference variable. So here's a couple of items for the most commonly used scale, the self-report questionnaire that measures need for cognition. So for example, I prefer my life to be filled with puzzles I must solve. The notion of thinking abstractly is appealing to me. With these two items, the higher your agreement with these items is, the higher you score on need for cognition, the more motivated you are to think deeply. This last item then, I usually only think as hard as I have to. It's got an R next to it, which means it's reverse coded. So the higher response is to this, the less need for cognition you have. So the less you are motivated to think deeply at a chronic level. So you can kind of think about yourself where you might fall, how you might respond to these questions. That'll tell you a bit where you might fall on the need for cognition scale. So do you like to think a lot or not, basically? If you have high need for cognition, you're more likely to be on the center route at any given moment. So the more motivated you are to think deeply all the time, the more likely you are to kind of always be evaluating messages carefully. Whereas the lower you score on need for cognition, the more likely you are to kind of chronically be on the peripheral route. Now again, situation can change that regardless of where you stand with need for cognition. Say that you have low need for cognition, but you've got a decision that you're accountable for. That might still amp you up into the central route. It just means you're more typically going to hang out in the peripheral route. All right, so that was motivation to think, right? But the other piece is ability. So motivation alone is not enough to ensure that you're on the central route. You also have to have the ability to think carefully. So you need to have the time and the energy, basically, to be able to think more about a persuasive message. There are a couple things that really impact ability to think that are particularly relevant here. One is simple time pressure. So you have to make a decision really, really quickly. If you have very little time to make a decision, then even if you were motivated to think carefully, because you have to make a decision so fast, then you have low ability to think carefully about those arguments, and you're less likely to be able to really be persuaded via the central route. So more time pressure means you're more likely to be on the peripheral route instead of the central route. Another is distraction, right? So say that you're in class and you're trying to listen to lecture or something like that. If the classmate right next to you is constantly texting and like laughing under their breath, that means your attention is going to be diverted. You're going to be distracted by that. You have less ability to think carefully about lecture if you're in a class listening, right? The same thing applies to persuasive messages. So if you're distracted from paying attention to whatever the message is, to the arguments in the message, the more distracted you are, the less able you are to think carefully about them. So the more distracted you are, the more likely you are to be on the peripheral route. Another is fatigue. So if you didn't sleep very well last night, you're probably not as well able to concentrate, in class or at work the next day, right? Because sleep deprivation really affects our ability to use our cognitive resources to the fullest extent. So if you didn't sleep well last night, or you're chronically tired for one reason or another, that also impacts your ability to think carefully. So even if you're motivated to, but you're too tired to really do it, that's again gonna knock you back down to peripheral route, because you need both motivation and ability, right? Then the last one we can talk about here is just simple lack of knowledge. So do you just not have the needed information or the background knowledge to interpret whatever the message is? If you don't have the knowledge to do so, then you have low ability to think more about it. So if someone is trying to convince me about, I don't know, something related to quantum physics, which I know pretty much nothing about, then I just don't have the knowledge in order to think carefully about whatever their message is. They're trying to argue that some model in quantum, physics is better than another. I can't really focus on, I can't really elaborate on that because I just don't know enough. So even if you otherwise have perfectly good amount of ability and motivation to think carefully, if you just don't know enough about it to do so, to really evaluate it, then that again is going to prevent you from being on the central route. It's going to knock you back down to the peripheral route. All right, so here's a chart to show what is happening with the elaboration likelihood model. Right, the idea is that you're getting some kind of message, so some kind of persuasion message. Someone's trying to persuade you about something. Maybe it's a video ad on a YouTube video that you're going to watch, or it's a billboard that you're driving past, whatever. Somebody's trying to persuade you of something, right? The key here is going to be whether you have the motivation and ability to think. So if you say no, if you're lacking in even just one, motivation or ability, then that means you're going to be on the peripheral route. So if you don't have the motivation ability to think, then you're going to be on peripheral route. You're going to be paying attention to those peripheral cues. So the peripheral cues about the message are what's going to be determining persuasion. So again, that's things like the design of the ad, the colors, celebrity endorsement, all those kinds of like humor, jokes, all those kinds of things that don't really speak to whatever they're trying to persuade you about. They're just these things that are catching your attention. And in this case, these peripheral cues, that's what's going to determine your persuasion. So if it's a funny ad, you think it's hilarious, even though you don't really get any good arguments for why you should get that product, maybe you'll be persuaded that it's a good product and maybe you want to get it when you go to the store next time. Again, though, when you're on the peripheral route to persuasion, it doesn't mean less persuasion, right? It just means a different things are persuading you. So when you're on the peripheral route, and then it's those cues that are determining persuasion, then the attitude change it produces is going to be more temporary, so it's more likely to change the next time someone tries to persuade you the other direction. It's also not going to be very persistent over time, right? It's susceptible to later change, right? It's less predictive of behavior. So you're still getting persuaded on the peripheral route. It just has these consequences. It's not as long lasting. However, go back up to the top with the message here. We go back up to this question of whether you have a motivation and ability to think. If the answer is yes, you do have both motivation and ability to think carefully, that's when argument strength is what's going to determine persuasion. That's when you're going to be on the central route. You're going to be carefully evaluating those messages. And when you're carefully evaluating those messages, that's when the strength of the argument is determining your persuasion. So if somebody's giving you really good arguments, you go back to the vegetarianism example, if someone's giving you really good arguments for why you should go vegetarian, then you'll be like, oh, okay, yes, I buy that. Those make sense to me. That's what's going to determine your persuasion. And if you're persuaded via the central route, your attitude change tends to be more long-lasting and more resistant to later change. It's also more predictive of behavior, as we talked about before. So again, it's not the case that one means more persuasion, one means less. It's just different things that are persuading you. If you're on the center route, it's the it's the argument strength that's determining persuasion. Whereas if you're on the peripheral route, it's those cues, those kind of bits of humor or celebrity endorsement in the ad. That's what's determining persuasion. Alright, so central versus peripheral route. As we talked about a little bit before, you have to have motivation and ability to be on the central route. That means that most people tend to be more on the peripheral route. That's why you see so many ads that are not really giving you good arguments about the product. Instead, they're just using all these kind of funny jokes and whatnot because they're trying to catch people on the peripheral route who are just, waiting for the commercials on their TV show to end. So they're trying to get enough people there to get some persuasion going on. Now, we've talked a little bit, as we've talked about the ELM, about how those cornerstones that we talked about earlier map onto it. Talk a little more about that right now. Really, the truth of it is that the cornerstones of persuasion and the ELM often interact. So they often interact with each other. It's not the case that one or the other is happening. It tends to be the case that they're both happening, they're interacting with each other. So for example, we'll talk about one example here of source credibility. So credibility of the source who's giving the message matters either way, but people can give the appearance of credibility without swaying central route people. So think, for example, about an ad that uses a real doctor to endorse a product. So a real doctor is on the ad talking about how this product is going to be really helpful. That tends to sway central route people if it's a real doctor, right? That's like source credibility, right? That you have a doctor who's telling you about this ad. That's going to sway central route people, and it's going to sway peripheral route people as well, and be swayed by that source credibility. However, an ad that uses a TV doctor, so not a real medical doctor, but someone who plays one on TV, that can still sway peripheral route people because source credibility is a cue in this case. So source credibility is a cue, that's peripheral cue that they're paying attention to. But it's not going to sway central route people, right? Because they're going to think about it more. They're going to evaluate that message. They know that's not a strong argument. Just because you have, Dr. McDreamy or whatever who's endorsing this product on this commercial, central route people are going to know, hey, he's not a real doctor, so that's not convincing to me. So here, source credibility matters either way. When it's a real doctor, it's going to sway both peripheral and central route people. If it's a TV doctor, it's not going to convince central route people, but it might still convince peripheral route people. Now, as we talked about before in some of those ads, how they might be, a little bit of both central and peripheral. In reality, the best ads use both, right? So the best ads have these cues that are convince people who are on the peripheral route. So they use humor, they use celebrity endorsements, stuff like that. But they also include strong persuasive arguments so that they're going to get people on the center route as well. So the best ads, and even I would say probably the majority of ads, are going to use both of these to try to get the most people possible. So they're going to get everybody on the whole elaboration likelihood spectrum by using things that will appeal to people at either end. All right, that's the ELM in a nutshell. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about here is subliminal advertising. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. So to talk about subliminal advertising, let's take a quick detour back to priming. So if you remember from social cognition, we first talked about priming there. Priming is the process through which recent experiences increase the accessibility of some schema, trait, or concept. Accessibility just means is at the forefront of the mind, right? So priming, basically, this is referring to how easily some feeling, thought, emotion, attitude, or goal comes to mind. The accessibility of these things can go on to affect affect, behavior, and cognition. So we talked in social cognition, right? We talked about studies that show that priming can affect judgments and behavior. So we talked about the Donald paradigm, which is where participants were primed with word lists that included words related to either reckless or adventurous. Then they read that ambiguous paragraph about Donald and then rated how much they liked him. And in that study, they found that people who had been primed with the concept of adventurous liked him a lot more, whereas people primed with reckless thought he was pretty bad. All right, so that shows us how priming can affect judgments. And we talked about that study with the elderly prime that led participants to walk slower out of the lab. So they were doing the scrambled sentences task. And the people who got sentences to unscramble then had the theme of elderly people. When they then walked out of the lab, the Confederate who was timing them saw that they walked just a little bit slower on average than people who had gotten the neutral prime. So that shows that priming can affect behavior. So this idea of priming then, right, is related to what we're going to talk about now with subliminal advertising. Now, remember in social cognition, we talked about the two methods of priming. We talked about supraliminal priming, which is where the priming is occurring within conscious perception. So you're aware of the cue that's delivering the prime, although you're not necessarily aware of its effect. This is the vast majority of priming, right? When you're primed with words or images or smells or music, you're conscious of the cue and you can recall it, even if you don't know you're being primed. That was like when we started this off in social cog and we did that sleep demo where you memorized those words that were related to sleep, but sleep wasn't one of them, and then later you thought it was, right? That was supraliminal. You weren't aware probably that I was priming you with sleep, but you were aware of the cues, you were aware of the words. So the vast majority of priming is supraliminal. Subliminal then, which is by far the minority of priming, this is where it's occurring outside of conscious perception. So you're not aware of either the cue or its effect. For example, the most common example of this would be like stimuli flashed on a screen. So it's flashed so quickly that you don't even realize that you've seen anything at all. So consciously, you don't even know you saw anything, but your subconscious part of your brain is picking up on it, and that can then prime you. So most priming is supraliminal, right? So for example, the Donald paradigm and the elderly priming study were both supraliminal. You're not aware of the prime's effects, but you're aware of the prime. Now, when we're talking about priming in advertising, I'll give you first some examples of supraliminal advertising and then a little bit of subliminal. So the first example of supraliminal advertising, where you're aware of the cue but not necessarily its effect, is this FedEx logo. So maybe you've seen this before, maybe you've seen some discussion about this logo. If you notice, there's a little bit of priming going on here. If you look at the E and the X at the end here, if you look between the E and the X, it's forming this little arrow. So the long part of the arrow is that bottom part of the E, right? So that's a little arrow there. It's so subtle you might not even know it's there unless somebody points it out. But if you think about what an arrow that's pointing like this indicates, it tends to indicate things like movement, speed, direction, right? So what does FedEx do? They deliver packages. So this sort of subtle impression of movement and speed is probably priming you to think that FedEx is probably going to be pretty quick at delivering your packages. So this is supraliminal advertising. Even if you never knew that arrow was there, you're aware of the words in the logo. You're aware of the FedEx in the logo, so it's supraliminal in that case. Now, apparently the FedEx logo has won over 40 design awards. Wonder why? Probably because of the supraliminal priming going on. Here's another one, technically still supraliminal. It's the Amazon logo. So maybe you can see what's going on in this Amazon logo. The arrow, this kind of orange arrow, right, is pointing from A to Z. indicating that Amazon has everything from A to Z on it, right? It's lots of different things you can get on Amazon. Maybe the arrow that's pointing from A to Z also looks a little bit like a smile. We tend to like smiles. They activate the idea of happiness for us. So pretty sneaky, right? Technically still superliminal. All right, now let's get into the subliminal stuff. All right, so this first example of subliminal advertising, or at least subliminal priming, is from The Lion King. Maybe you've seen this before. If you'd like to watch it, the link is at the bottom here. I've also uploaded the link to the Blackboard module so you can watch the actual video itself. But I've got a screenshot of the pertinent moment that's on the next slide here. This is the pertinent moment. So here you can see where Simba is sort of flopping down onto the ground here. The leaves all blow up into the wind, and they look like they form the letters S-E-X. This is a big controversy when people first started noticing this. Apparently the real story here is that the special effects team wrote as SFX in here, short for special effects, but it just happens to look a little bit more like an S-E-X. People are really up in arms about this. Right, so a little bit of potential priming going on here. That's more subliminal probably because you're not really noticing it at all. Of course, though, that example was Disney, wasn't really meant to persuade anyone of anything. This, however, is definitely more on the persuasive end of things, on the subliminal advertising end of things. So this is the infamous rats videos. So again, I posted the link online so you can take a minute and watch it real quick. It's from the George Bush campaign. It was aired in 1999. So watch this video. It's about 20-30 seconds long. See if you can tell where the priming happens. So this video got a lot of backlash back in 1999 when it first aired. The Bush campaign pulled the ad after it started getting media attention. The media attention was coming because when they are putting words on the screen, I don't know, some 20 seconds into the video, something like that, when you're putting the words onto the screen there and it says, what is it, Democrats, something, something, then at one particular moment it looks like this. So here you can see it says rats. It's part of the word that's going on there, right? But just for a second there, it looks like it says rats. Because this is a pro-Bush, anti-Gore ad, it looks like they're kind of flashing the word rats here so fast that you can't really even see it. So maybe trying to get a little bit of priming going on here to activate negative opinions toward Al Gore. Now this, again, the Bush campaign says that they said at the time that they had no intention of doing this. I have no idea whether that's true or not, but regardless, it's one of those examples of subliminal advertising that people get really up in arms about when they realize that it's happening. So it turns out that the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, actually outlawed subliminal messages way back in 1974. So this was outlawed after Christmas ads were shown in the early 70s, where the words "get it" appeared momentarily after products were shown. So trying to bank on this subliminal advertising, trying to motivate people to actually go buy the products for Christmas. Another thing that contributed to the FCC outlawing subliminal messages was that in the late 1950s, ad executive James Vickery boasted far and wide that he had increased Coca-Cola sales after flashing the words "drink Coke" during movies. That turned out to be a hoax. He didn't really do that, or if he did, it wasn't really effective. But nevertheless, these kinds of things make people really nervous about the effects of subliminal advertising. So it's like this kind of image here, right, that people are concerned that movie theaters might be embedding things like "hungry, eat popcorn" into the movie, the subsides of the movie, and try to get them to actually go buy more concessions. So the FCC outlawed subliminal messages in their entirety in 1974, so it's not legal to embed subliminal messages like this. The question is, though, how effective is subliminal advertising really? So I'm going to tell you about one study here that examined subliminal advertising. It's the Lipton Ice study. It was done in Holland in 2006. What they did for this study is a little bit complicated, so stick with me. What they did for this study is they had participants come into the lab and they completed a computerized task. Now the computerized task is just a cover. The priming is happening within the computerized task. But the computerized task is what participants think they're there to do. So what they're doing is they're watching, or they're looking at the computer, they're seeing strings of letter like the two I have on the screen here, and they're identifying whether the strings contain a lowercase b. So if they hit a certain key, if the string contains a lowercase b, hit a different key if it doesn't. So that's kind of the pretext here, what they're supposed to be doing, what the cover is, the cover story for the entire study. Now what happens, the priming is happening subliminally, so they're between these strings of letters, they're being primed, so these couple of words are flashing on the screen so quickly they have no idea they've seen anything at all, they just see the computerized task they're doing, but they're being subliminally primed. Now one group of participants, so in one condition, they're primed with the words Lipton Ice, which was a very popular drink in Holland at the time, and in the other condition, they're primed with the second word here, the second letters here, it's the control condition, so they're still being subliminally primed with this control condition. It's a string of words that contains the same letters as Lipton Ice, but not forming a real word. So they're trying to hold the situation constant, even including the letters they're subliminally primed with, so the same letters, just scrambled so it doesn't really form a word. So these subliminal primes, these are happening immediately before every letter string. So participants are completing this computerized task. They're seeing strings of letters, identifying whether it contains a lowercase b. All of that is just a pretext so that they can embed the prime into the study. So they're being primed with Lipton Ice in one condition, or with this sort of nonsense word in the other condition before every string. So it's flashed so fast the participants couldn't see them at all. So it's only on the screen for 1/50th of a second. That's a very tiny amount of time. So you have no conscious knowledge of having seen this, but enough for your subconscious to pick up on it. After they complete all of these strings of letters, they complete the full computerized task, then they're asked a couple of questions. So they're asked to rate their likelihood of ordering Lipton Ice, so their intention of drinking Lipton Ice. So specifically the question they're asked is, if you would sit on a terrace right now, how likely is it that you would order Lipton Ice? So that is their behavior intention DV. So they're looking to see, does being primed with the words Lipton Ice, does that make you more likely to order Lipton Ice? In which case subliminal advertising would seem to be effective. Now they also measured their participants' current thirst level. So they checked their current level of thirst. And that'll be relevant in a second here. So the idea is this. If subliminal advertising works, if flashing things on a screen so quickly you can't even see it consciously, if that works to change your behavior, then the people in this study who were primed with Lipton Ice, so that first condition who were primed with Lipton Ice before every string of letters, they should be more likely to want to order it than people who were primed with that second control string of letters. Alright, so I'm going to show you the results here. So on the bottom here, the x-axis, you can see low thirst to high thirst, because as it turns out, level of thirst actually matters. On the y-axis here, intention to order Lipton Ice, so from low to high, so higher numbers mean greater intention of ordering Lipton Ice. The yellow line is going to be the Lipton Ice prime, and the black line is going to be the control prime. So here's the results. Turns out that the prime only works if people were already thirsty. So look at the control prime, the black line first. Between low thirst and high thirst, it's not really changing, right? It's going down a tiny, tiny, tiny bit, but it's basically a completely flat line. So that means you have about average intention to order Lipton Ice if you place it on the DV there. Not dependent on thirst. So control prime, that's the nonsense words, remember, the same letters but not forming the word. So here you can say thirst doesn't matter. Control prime, you're pretty much average intention to order. Now if you look at the Lipton prime line, that's the yellow line here. For low thirst, if you look at low thirst first, on the more left-hand side of the graph here, it's about the same as the control prime. So it's very slightly below, but that's not a statistically significant difference. So you can see that for people who are not thirsty, when they're doing this study, if you're not thirsty, then being primed with Lipton Ice has no effect on your intention to order Lipton Ice. So you're exactly the same as people who are primed with the control string, so not affected by subliminal advertising. If you look, however, at the right side of the graph here at high thirst, now you see a significant difference. You can see that the Lipton Ice prime, those participants have a significantly higher intention to order Lipton Ice as compared to that control prime with the black line at high thirst there. So people who are very thirsty when they're doing this study and being primed with Lipton Ice are significantly more likely to say they're going to order it. So they are being affected by the ad. So this suggests that subliminal advertising can work, but it only works under very specific circumstances. In this study, that means it only works if you're already thirsty. So these participants who are doing this study, if they're not thirsty while they're doing it, then no matter how much they're being primed with Lipton ice, it doesn't do a thing to their intention to order it later. So if you're low thirst, then you're not any more likely to want to order Lipton ice after everything's done, regardless of prime. However, if you're very thirsty, you're being primed with Lipton ice, then you are significantly more likely to want to order an iced tea after you finish the study. So subliminal ads can work, but only under very specific circumstances. And maybe you can spot additional limitations to the effect of Lipton ice based on this study. So on the next slide, I've got some more limitations of subliminal priming, subliminal advertising in general. All right, so limitations of subliminal priming. One big one is that it may or may not affect actual behavior. So the Lipton ice study, which seemed pretty convincing that if you're thirsty, you're more likely to order it, that was just intentions. That was self-report. We have no idea if that maps onto actual behavior. So in that study, they just looked at intentions. They didn't necessarily give them the opportunity to actually drink Lipton ice. So based on that study alone, we have no idea whether subliminal priming actually affects behavior. So that's one big limitation. So subliminal priming might affect your self-reports of likelihood to do something, but does it affect whether you actually do that thing? We don't know. Another limitation is that subliminal priming is very unlikely to persuade you away from your original attitude. So if any of you watching this are not fans of iced tea, would you ever want to order it? No matter how thirsty you are, would you want to order it if you don't like iced tea? Just being primed would never work, right? Subliminal priming would never work on you if you already don't like iced tea, no matter how thirsty you are. If you remember also when we talked about priming in social cognition, remember that priming study with the elderly prime and walking behavior? We talked about how in a follow-up to that study, they looked at whether people's schemas about the elderly have an effect, and they find that they do. So only participants with a positive schema about the elderly slowed down. If participants had a negative schema about the elderly, they actually walked faster to get away, right? So subliminal priming likely has a similar effect. Only works if you already like the product. So only if you already like iced tea and you are thirsty while you're doing whatever that task is, that's when the priming works. Now, people get really freaked out about subliminal priming, thinking that they're somehow going to be convinced to do things that they would never want to do by subliminal priming. That's incredibly unlikely to happen, right? Subliminal priming, if it works at all, is only going to kind of talk you into doing something you already wanted to do, basically. So not likely to persuade you away from your original attitude. Another big limitation of subliminal priming, and one that we talked about with the Lipton ice study, is that it's moderated by lots of different variables. So moderated meaning it's an interaction. So the prime only works depending on if other things are already happening. So in the Lipton ice study, we saw that the effect of the prime was moderated by participants' level of thirst. So the prime only worked if they were already thirsty, right? So if the prime doesn't work indiscriminately, in that study it had no effect at low thirst levels. So subliminal priming, subliminal advertising alone doesn't have these blanket effects, right? It's moderated by lots of variables. All in all then, subliminal priming, subliminal advertising, only likely to work under certain situations. So not probably as big of a threat as a lot of people seem to think. Instead, pretty limited. So indeed, additional work supports the very limited utility of subliminal advertising. So in one subliminal ads meta-analysis, what they did is they examined the results from 23 different research studies on subliminal advertising. Now, when I say the word meta-analysis, this is a statistical procedure where you're combining results from lots of different studies, and you look at the overall trend. So in one single study, not a meta-analysis, but one single study, you're looking to see whether some psychological effect seems to be real, right? Meta-analysis is like taking the results of lots of different studies that are all looking at the same question and kind of like averaging their effects. So saying, all right, some studies, found very strong effects, some found very weak effects, some found no effects. What's the overall trend? Is there an effect? So if all of those 23 studies had shown strong effects of subliminal advertising, the meta-analysis would show strong effects. If they had all shown weak effects, the meta-analysis will show weak effects. If there was a lot of sort of ambiguity, some high, some low, some medium, then it averages them out, basically. That's what a meta-analysis is doing. In this meta-analysis of subliminal advertising that was done in 1996, they found that overall, the overall trend from these 23 research studies was that subliminal ads had a very negligible effect on consumer choice. So for subliminal ads to work in any kind of a scary way, they'd have to be so effective as to actually reverse your opinion, right? But this meta-analysis results suggest that no, that's definitely not happening. So overall, subliminal ads have very little choice, have very little effect on your choices when you're buying products. So if you were previously worried about the effects of subliminal advertising, you probably don't need to be as worried about it, because it turns out that even if it does work, only in very limited circumstances, overall not a huge effect on your choices on what you're doing or what you're buying, what you're spending your money on. However, regular old persuasion is easily far more effective. So again, even if subliminal ads might sometimes exert some influence, like in that Lipton Ice study, they are far overshadowed by the effects of regular old persuasion. So what I mean by regular old persuasion is just everything else we've talked about this entire week in persuasion. So for example, those cornerstones of persuasion, the central versus peripheral we talked about, that stuff has way huge effects on your choices, your consumer decisions. That stuff affects you way more. You're way more persuaded by that stuff than by subliminal ads. So again, you probably don't need to worry too much about subliminal advertising affecting you. All right. So even though you don't have to worry about subliminal ads, you do have to worry about regular old persuasion. And sometimes you just don't want to be persuaded, right? Sometimes you don't want to be persuaded to go buy some product that you don't really need. So in that case, we can talk a little bit about how people resist persuasion attempts. So people certainly don't always change their attitudes after hearing persuasive messages. So receivers of messages do not always change their attitudes. So if we truly believe in something, or we don't even need some kind of product that we're seeing an ad for, how do we resist their arguments or their ad campaigns? So there are a lot of things that you can do both in the moment and ahead of time. So first, let's talk about some things you can do in the moment. Some ways to resist persuasion attempts. One is to counter-argue. So to counter-argue means to come up with arguments against the advocated position. So you're trying to discount the other side. So for example, if someone's trying to convince you that some person is the best candidate for a local government position, somebody's trying to say, hey, you should vote for this person for this local position, you can counter-argue by bringing up problems with that person's voting history or bad things that person did in a previous position. Basically, you can say, no, that person's not the best one. So you're coming up with arguments against that advocated position, against whatever they're trying to convince you of in the message. You can also do something called bolstering, which is where you come up with arguments in favor of your own opinion. So if you're bolstering, you're building up your own side, not discounting the other. So in bolstering, that'd be like, again, if somebody tries to convince you that some given person is the best candidate for a position, but you think somebody else is a better candidate, if you're going to bolster, you're going to come up with arguments why your candidate is the best. Not necessarily why their candidate is the worst, but why yours is the best. Or for another example, say someone tries to convince you that the Patriots are the best football team. If you're not a Patriots fan, maybe you think the Dolphins are the best football team. You can bolster by bringing up reasons why the Dolphins really are the best. But discounting the Patriots, that would be counter-arguing. So when you're trying to resist persuasion attempts, you often will do both of these kind of at the same time. You'll do some counter-arguing and some bolstering, but either way they mean these different things. So counter-arguing is, no, your position's wrong. Bolstering is, hey, my position's right. But the most effective way to resist persuasion is not to fight it in the moment with counter-arguing or bolstering, but to anticipate it. So to think about it ahead of time and be ready when somebody tries to persuade you. So not just to respond when you hear it, but to build up your attitude strength ahead of time. So building up attitude strength is the best way to do this, because stronger attitudes, as we've been talking about, are more resistant to persuasion. So the stronger your attitude is, the more resistant you are to attempts to persuade you. So one way that you can do this is by this technique called forewarning. So with forewarning, what's going on is you're reminding people, or perhaps you're reminding yourself, that others might attempt to persuade them. This forewarning, which really just means exactly what it is, warning ahead of time, that people might try to persuade you, it lets people think of counter-arguments and bolsters ahead of time. So rather than trying to generate those counter-arguments and bolsters in the moment, Forewarning lets people come up with them ahead of time before they even really need to deal with them. So the more time you have to think about it on your own, the less pressure you feel in the moment, the better off you are when you actually do get this persuasive message. So basically you're telling people or yourself that they might someday receive persuasive messages. That allows you to think of counter-arguments and bolsters ahead of time while you're not under that immediate pressure. More effective that way. Another similar tactic is something we call inoculation. So the inoculation hypothesis says that a weak dose of persuasion allows people to build up defenses and resist persuasion. The idea of the inoculation hypothesis is that giving people a weak argument allows them to practice counter-arguments and bolsters and thus resist persuasion to later strong arguments. So basically practicing your arguments, even against a weak persuasion attack, which is what inoculation hypothesis is, helps you resist in the future. So it's a lot like getting a shot or a vaccine. When we inoculate ourselves against the flu every season, we're immunizing ourselves with a little bit of the virus so we can resist the big thing when it comes, the real thing when it happens. So that's how vaccines work. You give a very weak version of the virus so that you can build up antibodies and fight it off. So that later when you get the real virus trying to creep in, your body's like, nope, I got this. That's what inoculation is. That's what immunization is, right? That's what a vaccine is. That's the same idea here. We're basically immunizing our attitudes. So we're getting a vaccine psychologically, so to speak. So we're getting a weak dose of persuasion, like that weak dose of the virus in the vaccine, a weak dose of persuasion that lets you build up your defenses, your antibodies to persuasion, so to speak, and helps you resist it later when you get the real thing. Now remember, inoculation versus forewarning, they're two different things. Forewarning is just telling people that they might undergo persuasion attempts. So you're just telling them, hey, you might face with this later, and they come up with their ideas. Inoculation is actually practicing arguing against weak persuasion attempts. So inoculation includes a weak persuasion attempt that people are arguing against. So forewarning is just kind of thinking about it. Inoculation is actually practicing. So one study, an inoculation study that shows how this works. Now in inoculation studies, they typically use commonly held beliefs that people have not really defended against prior, like whether we should have car airbags. Probably nobody's really tried to be persuaded that we should or shouldn't have car airbags. They just kind of are in all of our cars. They do this in inoculation studies so that they can get rid of issues with previous counter-argument generation for the purposes of the study. So they're trying to eliminate any past practicing of counter-arguments of things that people typically are having good counter-arguments for. So they come up with these kind of weird, seemingly arbitrary, or seemingly overwhelmingly good or bad things that they've never practiced arguing against. Now in this particular study done in the 70s, they had participants read arguments against having airbags installed in cars. So participants were reading arguments that were saying, hey, we shouldn't have airbags installed in our cars. Even in the 70s, this was kind of an interesting idea. Unfortunately, I don't know what the attack contained. I tried to look it up and see what they actually said about why we shouldn't have airbags in cars, but the article doesn't say. I would guess it's stuff about it being expensive and not really needed, but that's just my guess. At any rate, though, the participants were reading these arguments about having airbags installed in cars. These arguments were saying we shouldn't. Now, the independent variable here is that the participants who were reading these arguments had either practiced generating counter-arguments beforehand, so they'd gotten that little weak dose of persuasion beforehand and practiced generating their counter-arguments, so they'd done that inoculation before they got the real thing, or they immediately read the persuasive message. So in that second condition where they immediately read the message, that's the control condition with no inoculation versus that first condition had the inoculation. The DV then is after all of this happens, after they read these arguments against having airbags in cars, they write their agreement with the necessity of car airbags. So they're looking to see, do the participants who were inoculated, who practiced their counter arguments ahead of time, do they end up having less persuasion when they read this article that says we shouldn't have airbags in cars? So basically testing, does the inoculation hypothesis actually work? So I'm going to show you the results here. On the x-axis here, on the left side, we have the no inoculation condition. That's the people who just immediately read the article against having airbags. Then on the right side that's the inoculation condition, the people who practiced their arguments first. On the y-axis, attitude toward airbags in cars. So this is their DV where they rated the necessity of having them in the cars. So the higher numbers here indicate greater agreement that they're necessary, lower numbers indicate less. Now you're going to see two bars in each of these. The sort of light blue bar is the baseline, so this is their This is their attitudes toward having airbags in cars right before they read the messages. And then the darker blue is going to be post-attack, so it's post-reading those articles that say we shouldn't have airbags in cars. All right. So first, let's look at the baseline conditions here. So these light blue bars for both no inoculation and inoculation condition. As you can see, there's no difference. So they measured attitude toward airbags in cars. Again, higher numbers mean more positive attitude. There's no difference in baseline between inoculation and no inoculation. That's exactly what we would expect based on random assignment, right? There has been no independent variable at the baseline. This is just people across both conditions have about the same level of agreement that cars should have airbags. Now, if we look at the post-attack, this dark blue bar for the no inoculation condition, we see attitude change. So we see that post-attack meaning post-reading that article against airbags in cars, these participants are less positive toward having airbags in cars. So basically the persuasion worked. That article did persuade these people that we don't really need to have airbags in our cars. So persuasion worked in this case. People changed their attitudes. If we look now at the post-attack bar for the inoculation condition, what do you know? It's not very different from the baseline. So there's not nearly as much attitude change. There's still a little drop here. It's not exactly identical to the baseline. There's a little tiny drop here, but mostly they stuck to their guns. So again, they're all reading the same article that says we shouldn't have airbags in cars. It's just that the people in the inoculation condition practiced their arguments ahead of time, whereas the people in the no inoculation condition did not. And it shows that just as suspected, inoculation helps people to resist attitude change. That helps people to resist persuasion attempts. So with something like airbags in cars, you probably don't really want to be persuaded against it, or you can think of other issues that you might not want to be persuaded about in the future. Inoculation is a really good tool for you to avoid having your attitude change when you don't really want it to be changed. So inoculation works. All right, so let's do our video response part 2 on the next slide here. All right, so here is the prompt here. So again, you can write this on the same document as your video response part 1. For this, I want you to choose a topic or an issue that you think other people are likely to try to persuade you about in the future. For example, a political candidate, a religious missionary has come to your door, or some university policy is going to be implemented. If you don't want to be persuaded about whatever the topic or issue is, how would you resist the attempt? So outline a few different ways you could do this. So when you're outlining your different ways, don't just write the names of the different ways, right? Write the name and then how you could do it in this specific example. So choose a topic or issue you think people are going to persuade you about and outline some ways you could resist that persuasion. So once you're done with this, you can come back here, watch the last few slides here, and then we'll be good to go. Alright, so we've talked about a lot in these last 3 days of attitudes and persuasion, right? We started out last week talking about what an attitude is. We talked about attitude structure, how we form them, whether they always predict behavior, and why they sometimes don't. We talked about when we change our own attitudes through cognitive dissonance. We talked about how we don't like feeling uncomfortable, right? And we want to reduce that distance. We want to get back to consonance as much as possible. Often the easiest way to do that is to change one of our cognitions, which is often an attitude, right? So we talked about cognitive dissonance, and then we talked about when other people can persuade us through those cornerstones of persuasion, and then in today's video lecture, the ELM, subliminal advertising, and how to resist persuasion attempts. Now some final thoughts on this topic here. We have attitudes about virtually everything, as we talked about last Thursday, so we can form them in more controlled or more automatic ways. Controlled like that learning approach, right? Automatic, more like mere exposure and conditioning. So we can form them lots of different ways. And sometimes they predict behavior, but it's important to know when they do and when they don't. We also talked a lot about cognitive dissonance. We talked about how we can resolve it in a variety of ways, but that we typically choose whichever way is easiest. So often it might seem like the most logical way to resolve our dissonance is to change our behavior. That may or may not be the most logical way, but often it's not the easiest way. We prefer taking the easiest way whenever we can. And then from Tuesday and today, people can persuade us using all kinds of tactics, right? There are so many they can choose from, all of those cornerstones, and even more that we didn't have time to talk about. But not all techniques are equally effective, right? So we talked about how they're dependent on the recipient's level of elaboration. We talked, for example, about that source credibility example, where if you have a doctor, or somebody who plays a doctor on TV, that's not going to be persuasive, even though it's a source effective credibility, not going to be persuasive if you're high in elaboration, right? And we also talked about how if you want to resist a persuasion attempt, your best defense is to think and prepare ahead of time. All right, that's it for the video lecture today. So be sure to turn in your video response via Blackboard. It's due by 11:59 p.m. today on March 1st, which is Thursday, right? So it's due by 11:59 p.m. today. So be sure that you turn that in. It can be all in the same document. That's totally fine. Just make sure your name's on it somewhere. Be sure that you submit it, get it in there. Ideally, please submit it with a Word document or PDF. It's much harder for me to access sort of Mac files, basically. I can still access it, but I prefer it to be in Word or PDF. All right, that's it for the video lecture. Hope that everything made sense. We'll take a little bit of time after spring break on Tuesday when we come back and talk about whether there was anything confusing about this. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a fantastic spring break, and I'll see you in a little over a week.